Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Nick and Joe Show. And I was about to say the date, but I can't give you the date because I don't know. All I know is it's sometime in July, and here we are. It's the dog days of summer here in Ottawa, and boy, was it hot and humid today here, and which is just a way of sort of telegraphing one of the topics we're going to be talking about tonight, and that is one of our favorites, climate change. Anyway, I'm Joe, and Nick is not with us tonight. Tonight we have our regular guest host, Chris Fraser, who is also in Ottawa, but he's coming to us from his home studio, I believe. Is that right, Chris?
Yeah, my home studio here in the beautiful Blackburn Hamlet. Downstairs,
Blackburn,
it's nice and cool.
Blackburn Hamlet. Do you guys have air conditioning there? Well, that
Yeah,
sounded like that sounded like a question about. Do you guys have air conditioning in Blackburn Hamlet? That's kind of like the third world of Canada or something like that, which is not my intention. Okay, for all of you guys who live in Blackburn Hamlet, if anyone's in us watching the show or listening to the podcast, okay, I didn't mean anything by it. It was a slip of the tongue.
no, that's a fair
Blackburn
question.
Hamlet's a lovely place.
If you'd asked that question 50 years ago, it would have been a sensible question because it was all farmland out here 50 years ago.
Well, less than 50 years ago,
Yeah,
I'm thinking, well, I kind of could remember, but I don't remember being in Blackburn Hamlet or in that area 50 years ago. But being almost 60 years old now, uh, I have seen a lot. The changes in this city are remarkable. But of course, I think that's the way it is with every metropolitan area, probably in the world. And everybody, who starts as they start to get a little older, they always go, "Oh yeah, yeah." I remember back when. So if you want to play a little bit of the Ottawa trivia, I remember when Merivale Road only went as far as Slack, and then after Slack Road, it was like a cow. It was just a trail. It wasn't even a road.
right.
Um, uh, okay, I 417 didn't exist. We did have a divided highway. I was born after they created the Queensway in Ottawa, but it didn't go. It only went not quite as far as Bell's Corners, or just about Bell's Corners, and Montreal Road. It only went to Montreal Road, and everything else was just a regular Highway 17, no divided highway or anything like that. Of course, 416 is relatively new. So, anyway, that's the Ottawa trivia for tonight. And of course, Nepean wasn't even a city, but we didn't live in Nepean anyway. We lived out in the country. But
Right.
Nepean only became a city, I think, in 1978. So before that, it was Nepean Township. But Nepean Township still had its own police force and its own fire department, and it's all this stuff. And that's a separate issue altogether as well. We could get into that at some point in time, how municipal governments finance themselves. Anyway, good to see you today, Chris. We haven't talked for a while. Haven't seen one another for, well, a couple of months anyway. You're looking
Yeah,
good.
it's been a while. Yeah, I just saw a comment as we were talking about the city expanding. Craig says hello, and Chrissy says, "Sure remember 10th line in Innis when they were farms and fields. Times sure have changed." And yeah, Chrissy, you're right. Times have changed a lot. And even I remember when Innis Road was not it was like a little trail just like 30 years ago, and
Sure.
now with the potholes, it's still a trail, but but
Yeah,
there's no Innis.
but I'm not going to get into any of that tonight. It's I'm saving my powder. I'm keeping my powder dry on all of that.
Right,
Um, uh, Chris, we have, as you know, we have listeners and participants not just from around the country, but in different countries around the world, and so they probably don't want to get into too much about how the roads have changed, and we have potholes here in Ottawa, and every municipality suffers from the same problem,
right.
and some countries worse than others. So, you know,
Yeah,
but we had a few topics, and one of the things I think we wanted to just sort of touch base on really early on is the sort of like a go-to topic for us, and that is the whole subject of climate change. And if you've been following the news lately, first of all, we here in Ontario the major municipalities in Ontario have had heat warnings, extreme heat warnings issued for the populations. And my wife and I were talking about this earlier today about okay, it's hot, but it's not the hottest I've ever seen it in
Me
Ottawa,
neither.
but they still issue heat warnings. And it's kind of, you have to ask yourself, what is the point of the government issuing a warning telling you that it's pretty hot outside and maybe you should, find a place that's cooler if there's air conditioning, or make sure that you're drinking properly, stay in the shade a little bit. All of the things that I think that we all grew up with, which was just common sense. You don't overheat yourself in the middle of the day in the summertime when it's hot out. I think the temperature here in Ottawa was something like 31 degrees, and then they add on the humidity. And Canada, by the way, is one of the only countries, Chris, that actually has a humidex.
Is that right?
It's other countries don't touch that kind of stuff. So it's humid. So they say, well, it's 31 degrees, but it feels like 34 or 35. And I'm thinking to myself, well, that's hot, no question about it, but it's not the hottest I've ever seen, and it's not it's not hotter. I mean, compared to some other countries in the world, 35 degrees is not at all an unusual temperature. People probably go to bed at night thinking, oh, phew, the temperature dropped to 35 degrees from 45 or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, this morning I heard it was going to be warm, so I said, well, I like to rollerblade, so I thought I'm going to go out for a rollerblade, and my intention was to get out by about 9:30 when it was quote unquote cooler, and then stuff kept happening, and I didn't really get out until 11 a.m. and it was getting warm, but I got out of my car, I put the blades on, I just went a kilometer down the road and back again, and I thought, this isn't that bad. It's like it's warm, but it's not like the sun was beating down on me, and it was like, this is what they're warning about. It's like I had a drink before I went, and I just went down the road about a kilometer and a half and came back, and I thought, this is quite tolerable, actually.
Well, I guess it begs the question: what is the point of the heat warning? I mean, is it that if somehow or other, if you happen to suffer from heat stroke, which happens, okay, heat stroke is not a new phenomenon. It's something that we were warned about and taught about when we were younger. And you look after yourself in the heat, you look after yourself in the cold, and that's just the way it is with human beings. But I'm trying to wrap my mind around the point of the government telling us it's too hot, as if to say, okay, well, if the government forgot to give us our heat warning today, I guess it's okay for us to go out and risk heat stroke, running a marathon when it's 35 degrees outside, which of course it wasn't 35 degrees here in Ottawa.
No.
So, there's a certain amount of inducing of panic, I think, sometimes with governments when they institute these kinds of policies. Here's another thing: I never once missed school because of cold weather. Of course, being out of the country, we would miss school if there was a blizzard, okay, because you
Right.
couldn't get around because of the snow in the roads. But we never missed school because of extreme cold. And I remember, boy, when my kids were growing up, there was one day I stopped at the coffee shop and the kids were with me, and they came in. I ordered a coffee, and I was leaving, and the proprietor, it was a private, it wasn't one of the chains, it was just a privately owned coffee shop, and the
Right.
guy I knew, he said to me, um, I see your kids are with you today. You keeping them for the full day? And I said, no, I dropped them off at school. He says, no, the school's closed. This was like in June. I'm going, yeah, what do you mean the school's closed? He said, because of heat. I'm going, come on, you're pulling my leg. I'd never heard of such a thing before. But it turned out he was right. They had closed the school for the day because of heat. Now, of course, the schools, I don't know what they do now about air conditioning, but the older schools and that we're going back now 20 some years, almost 20 years or thereabouts. So, the schools that my kids were in were not air conditioned, so I could understand how the heat would be stifling. And I remember sitting in school and it being so hot that you'd put your head down and the sweat would drip off
Yeah,
onto your notebook.
that's right.
Anyway, but I don't recall anyone ever suffering from heat stroke. So I don't know what it is. I don't begrudge the government having some sort of standard in saying this, but I think what bothers me about it, all of this, Chris, is that the it's almost as though the government has to tell us what to do and what not to do, and it sort of induces this, I don't know, catatonic state, if you will, in people where they're just sort of walking around going, I don't know what's going on. It's too hot. Why is it too hot? Well, because the government said it was too hot.
Yeah,
I don't know.
it's like, yeah, how
Am I
you would if you
am I
didn't
being
have
too cynical here?
no, if you didn't have someone warning you about the weather, you probably wouldn't even know. Like I would have gone out today if they had have said it was 25 degrees, I would have believed them, and I wouldn't have known the
Well,
difference. I just would
well,
have believed
here's
them.
well here's a little known fact, and people don't realize it. But when I tell it to you, you'll immediately go, I never thought of that, but it's true. You cannot sense temperature. Human beings can't sense temperature. They can only sense temperature difference. So if you go outside and it's 30 degrees and you're coming outside from an air conditioned building, you're going to feel a blast of heat.
Right,
But if you spend 15 or 20 minutes outside in 30-degree temperature, um, you're not going to feel that blast of heat. You'll feel other effects from the heat, but you won't feel the blast, the real temperature. It's you sense, you don't sense temperature. You actually sense temperature difference, and so yeah, that's an interesting thing. But
that kind of makes sense because when I was out at the our condo pool yesterday, so it was warm, but it was as I walked to the pool, I thought, it's hot, but it's not that terrible. And our pool is not heated, so it was pretty chilly getting into the pool. So I was in the water for about 20 minutes. Then I came out, um, sat in one of the Muskoka chairs they had in the shade. And as I was sitting in the shade, I just closed my eyes and had a little rest, and the temperature was perfect. I didn't feel overly warm at all. It was just perfect. So you're right. Like I was outside, the temperature on the thermometer might have been 29 or 30, but I felt completely comfortable in the shade. So if you'd asked me at that point, what's the temperature? I would say, well, feels like 24, 25 to me, but it was actually warmer.
right, and you'll be outside at 24 and 25 degrees, and it feels, if you're spending your time outside, it's going to feel mostly like the same as it feels at 28 or 29 degrees or 30 degrees. Now, look, if it starts getting into the mid 30s, okay, you're going to feel other effects. Um,
Right.
uh, but uh, but it's not that you're feeling the heat per se. You might be feeling the effect of heat if you're not used to it. And this, nobody should be listening to what we're saying here, Chris, and or watching us and thinking, okay, well, we don't have to worry anymore about the heat because Benamy and Fraser said it, right. Look, the fact is, you're not, especially if you're from a colder climate like we are. Your body's not used to being out there in 35-degree heat. So, you have to slow things down, and you have to make sure you're drinking enough water, staying hydrated, and all of that, because you can suffer from heat stroke.
Right.
And heat stroke can kill you. So, but this is all sensible stuff that we learned as children. So again, going back to the government, but I want to talk, on the subject of climate change and all of this stuff. I've been watching the news and reading the news reports coming out of Europe, where the temperatures are somewhat the same as they are here. They're when they have a heat wave, they're looking at low to mid 30s in terms of temperature, maybe 36, maybe 37 degrees. And we're doing, apologize to our Fahrenheit people. I don't even know what that is in Fahrenheit anymore. So we're just going to stick to the Celsius. But and again, it's hot. It's hot. But I'm watching the headlines, CNN, um, uh, Europe burning, I'm going,
Yeah.
Europe's not burning. Um, uh, yeah, I was there in 2018 for a series of conferences and meetings, etc. And they were going through quite a heat wave at that time. And they were talking, 35, 36 degrees, some of the high temperatures. And that's pretty hot for, middle to Northern Europe. But you turn on the American stuff and they were talking about how, the Europe people were just dying in droves, right? I mean, that was the impression that they gave people, but that's just not the way it was. So, there's this again a certain amount of inducing alarm. I think that we that we have our news uh, our news outlets participate in.
They definitely like to sensationalize things, that's for sure. And I guess that, it creates clicks on the internet, and it makes people watch when this story is more spectacular. So I understand like kind of why they're doing it, but then again, when I was a kid, it didn't seem like they were doing it to the same extent. And now, when you think about climate change, I do remember going to public school here in Ottawa, and the winters were seemed to be snowier back then. It seemed to me just
Sure.
once you get to Halloween, it seems when I was a kid, it was like half the time we were in our snowsuits trick or treating, and a lot of people in my age group say, yeah, I remember that. It seems much colder back then. As soon as you got to November, we never even thought that is it going to be a white Christmas or not. It was going to be a white Christmas. It was just always a white Christmas. But I think that's just the way that the world goes. It goes in cycles. I mean, uh, 20, 30 years from now, maybe we'll be going back to having snowy Octobers again. Who knows? But let the earth do its thing. When I was talking about sitting at the pool, by the way, yesterday, there was one other guy at the pool at the time, and I don't know how we got into the subject, but I said, "Yeah, it's pretty hot out," and he says, "Yeah," he says, "Not like Europe though," and I said, "Yeah, it's pretty hot over in Europe," and then he looks at me and he says, "And people say there's no climate change," and I thought, "Oh no, here we go." So I just looked at him and I thought, I'm not going to get into a debate with this guy, but I said to him, I said, "Well, there's climate change, but I don't think that humans are causing it. It's just there could be other sources too." And so he could kind of see that I was not getting on board with him totally. So he says, "Yeah, I guess there's different circumstances, things that could change the climate," but I was not going to jump on board his bandwagon to say that we have to fix it with. I have a headline here. It says Biden unveils $2.3 billion plan to fight climate change. So we can just change the climate by throwing money at it. That's it.
Well, 2.3 billion. Is that what you said?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's a fraction of what they're talking about spending in the city of Ottawa. 60 billion. Well, not quite 60 billion, let's be fair. I mean, 57 point something billion dollars to fight climate change. But look, I like to point out to people that I'm certainly not a climate change denier. I'm not even a I'm not even a climate change skeptic. The fact is that here we are sitting in Ottawa, and if the climate didn't change, we'd be sitting under somewhere around 2 kilometers or 3 kilometers of glacial ice still. So, on the
Right.
balance, climate change has worked well for us. Those glaciers have been receding for tens of thousands of years, and if there are remnants of glaciers, then that's fair. And if they're going to continue to melt because the temperatures continue to gradually increase, and I don't know that they are, but it's people I think have to expect that that's just the way that the world works. I'm a little more circumspect when it comes to the argument about human induced climate change and whether or not we're actually in a climate emergency. But that's because Chris, I'm old enough to have a little perspective on this. And the first time I was hearing about, the imminent catastrophic rise of sea levels because of global warming was more than 40 years ago. Sea levels do rise, but at a cataclysmic rate. It hasn't happened yet over 40 some odd years. So as I say, I'm a little more circumspect about that. But look, here's my answer to the climate change dilemma here in Canada, and that is this: uh, whether you believe it's man caused by human activity or just natural cycles of nature, okay? The fact is that we in Canada only produce somewhere about 1.6% of all greenhouse gases. So
Right.
we could eliminate all greenhouse gas emissions from Canada, and it's going to have virtually no impact on climate change. So, insofar as a policy to deal with climate change, the prudent, sensible policy that we should be adopting here in Canada is adapting to climate change.
Right.
And just a couple of weeks ago, as you'll recall, or maybe a little more than a couple of weeks ago, we just had a thunderstorm pass through Ottawa that knocked out uh, electrical power for, in many cases, more than a week to almost 200,000 households. Now, not a hurricane, not a tornado, but a thunderstorm. And that's happening with greater frequency. And when people lose their power, a lot of them tend to panic and they go, "Wow, it's climate change." But really what it is it's deteriorating infrastructure. So if we were smart, we'd be spending some of that money. In fact, we'd probably be spending most of that money in strengthening our infrastructure, modernizing our power distribution grids, and in order to withstand not just extreme weather events that are caused by climate change, if you want to talk about hurricanes and tornadoes, but how about just strong windstorms from thunderstorms? So, when we talk about spending money to try to stop climate change, insofar as Canada is concerned, that is 180 degrees the wrong policy to adopt.
Right. And I have a friend of mine who has a place down in Florida, which I go to visit sometimes. And we walk around the neighborhood, and in that neighborhood, most people, pretty well everybody, if you're sensible, you have special windows that are hurricane proof, and then they have shutters over the windows that are hurricane proof, because they know in that part of the world hurricanes are going to happen, or are likely to happen. Maybe
Right.
not bad ones every single year, but every like 4 or 5 years, you're going to get a bad hurricane season. So the best that people can do down there is put the special hurricane proof windows on their homes and put the special shutters on so that your windows don't blow in. So you can't you can't prevent the hurricanes from coming, but you can, as you talk about infrastructure, if you can protect your house from what you think is might happen, and you want to do that because also for your insurance, you don't want to not have your house protected and then go to the insurance company and if they ask you, do you have hurricane proof windows? Did you have shutters? No. Well, sorry, we can't cover you. So it's a matter of looking at where you live and saying, well, let's protect ourselves the best that we can in case of a climate situation. I think that's the
Sure.
best that we can do.
Sure. Another good example of adapting to not necessarily the climate, but one's natural habitat is the Netherlands, where on an annual basis they continue to reclaim land from the sea, and much of the Netherlands, much of their agricultural area, is actually below sea level, and on purpose. I mean, not on purpose because they're going, "Gee, we really want to have below sea level agricultural land." No, that's not the point. The point is there isn't a whole lot of arable land in the Netherlands, and therefore they reclaim it from the ocean, from the sea, and they've been doing this now for centuries. So it's not like we don't know how to deal with rising sea levels. It's no question it's a challenge. But here's the thing, okay? Again, I'm going back to our policy here in Canada, and look, we could spend billions, tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars on a fantasy quest that we're going to slow down or stop climate change worldwide. The fact is, it's not going to happen. It's either not going to happen because we don't produce enough greenhouse gas emissions to make a difference here in Canada, assuming that you accept the argument that climate change is either accelerated or even induced by human activity. So it doesn't make sense for us to try to stop it, because we're not going to stop it. What makes sense is for us to find policies that are going to adapt to it and be prepared for it. And one more thought on this, Chris. And just watching the clock here, I know we're going to be coming up to a break pretty soon. But I think the fact that we're living in the second largest country in the world, one of the coldest climates in the world, with a population, our population centers are so widely spread out geographically. I think the fact that we only produce 1.6% of greenhouse gases for the entire country is pretty strong testimony to how environmentally friendly and conscientious Canadians really are. They do care about the environment. We Canadians do care about our natural environment, and we don't need politicians to be lecturing us day in and day out about how we're behaving badly and that we're destroying the world. That may be happening in some places, but it's not happening here. And I think that rather than lecturing and criticizing and putting down Canadians, I'd like to see our politicians giving them a little bit more of a pat on the back. Sure, encourage them to do more. We can always do more, but let's stop with the criticism and the attacking and the virtue signaling. Okay, we're doing pretty good in this country, and if you feel that you have to do something to lead the rest of the world, how about just bringing political leaders to Canada to see what we do? Because that's leadership. We don't have to play the virtue signaling game in order to show leadership around the world on this subject.
Right. And who among us does not want to have a cleaner, healthier environment? When my family moved to Ottawa South, this is back, dating myself now back to the late 60s, early 70s, there was a place on the Ottawa River called Brighton Beach. I remember as a kid, I would see people going down to the beach with their swimsuits and blankets and whatnot, and they would swim at Brighton Beach. And you don't swim down there anymore because of the pollution in the Ottawa River. So to me, that's a shame. And it would be nice to be able to go back to those days when you could swim in a place like that at Brighton Beach. There's other places along the Ottawa River where you can swim. Some people choose not to go to those places, but they're still swimmable. But sure, if we want to help the environment and get rid of the pollution in the rivers, that's fine. Now, but don't give me the guilt trip saying it's us, because I didn't do that. If Brighton Beach is no longer swimmable, I didn't do it. My family, my friends, we had no stake in that. I don't know how the pollution got there. I guess it's, industrialization, but what am I supposed to do? I don't have the power to stop pollution going into the water. I didn't do it.
I don't know the specifics about this beach that you're referring to, but for years, we were pumping raw sewage into the Ottawa River while everybody's talking about all these other things. And this is when I'm not talking about 50 or 40 or 30 years ago. I'm talking about 10 years ago, 5 years ago. We were still dumping raw sewage, a certain amount of raw sewage into the Ottawa River. So again, if you want to deal with the environment and you want to provide a safe environment for people, deal with that kind of stuff and stop with this. And sometimes I just feel like they're just using climate change and weather patterns, changing weather patterns as a pretext for forcing other economic changes and what have you. But anyway, I don't want to get into a conspiracy stuff. Okay, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm just saying, let's do the best we can, and we're doing pretty good. Keep up a good job. That's my message to Canadians, and we'll see how it goes from there. Chris, we've got to take a break here. I'm just looking at the clock. So, ladies and gentlemen, don't go away. We'll be back in a few minutes here on the Nick and Joe Show with me, Nick, and our guest host, Chris Fraser.
We all know that climate change is real. But with countries like China and India failing to do their part, What Canadians need now more than ever is a Made in Canada climate change plan. A real plan that responds to the real-world needs of Canadians. A balanced plan that supports responsible economic growth and strengthens our essential infrastructure. A responsible plan that protects our natural environment and ensures that all Canadians enjoy the blessings of clean air, clean land, and clean water for generations to come. It's time for Canadian politicians to show real leadership in the world, putting partisanship and ideology aside. It's time for a sensible climate plan. We're the International Climate Science Coalition Canada, and we're ready to help. To learn more, visit our website, icsc-canada.com.
All right, welcome back to the Nick and Joe Show. I'm Joe. He is not
I'm
Nick.
Chris.
He's Chris. And
You
we're
bet.
actually both in Ottawa. I'm sitting here in my home studio in Ottawa tonight, and Chris is sitting in his home studio, and we're just having a ball. And I'm not sure what happened with Nick this week. You talked to him, Chris. Are we violating any kind of secrecy or privileged or confidential information if you give us a hint on what's going on with Nick this week?
No big secrecy. I think he has a house full of guests this week. So he could have done the show, but like with a whole bunch of guests in his house, it might have been a bit disruptive. So he figured he'd give himself a break tonight, and I was happy to fill in for him.
Okay, well, we're glad to have you on the show. That's for sure. You're always welcome and a great addition. And we should have actually the three of us. We should have the three of us on from time to time. Actually,
Yeah,
we've done that before.
I should have said to Nick, why don't you just have your people in the background, and you could have like a studio audience right behind you.
That's actually a good idea.
Yeah.
But they wouldn't sit long. We actually what we could do is we could set Nick up with a green screen and then have him sitting, have a virtual background of an audience or something like that.
Right.
So
yeah.
that would be kind of fun, actually. So anyway, we were just talking about climate change and leadership around the world in the last segment, Chris. And before the show started, we were talking, you and I, and you were mentioning, the trials and tribulations of some of the leaders out there in the world today. And you mentioned Justin Trudeau. I don't know that Justin Trudeau is really experiencing the kind of difficulties in terms of his relationship with the electorate as Joe Biden potentially is going to experience soon with midterm elections. And as we saw Boris Johnson, and I have to tell you, I'm so disappointed in Boris Johnson. I'm a real Boris Johnson fan. I like the man. I like the fact that he's a little irreverent. I even kind of like the fact that, I guess it seems that he maybe thumbed his nose at some of the rules and procedures and stuff like that in England during the COVID quote unquote COVID crisis and the lockdowns, etc., having some parties and stuff like that. And I take it that some of that has contributed to the his downfall, or the fact that now he's had to announce that he's stepping down as soon as the Conservative Party finds a new leader. But this is not. It's not an isolated thing. I mean, even here in Canada, although we haven't seen this with Justin Trudeau, we certainly have seen it with the leaders, successive leaders in the Conservative Party, federally, and so my question is, what is really going on? What do you think is going on, particularly in the worldwide conservative movement?
It's interesting. Talking about Boris Johnson, I in a way I kind of like the style. The crazy hair sometimes would irritate me, but there was something. He had a certain charm. I don't know what it is. He had a certain charm about him, which I don't think anyone can deny. But no one, of course, would think that being a world leader is an easy job. Of course, it's not for the faint of heart. But at the same time, do you ask yourself the question, why do they do these like unforced errors? When we were in the middle of COVID, the rule was you can't have a certain number of people at your house and whatnot. All the rules were there, and Boris broke the rules. There were obviously photographers there. People were taking pictures. Did you not think that these pictures would get out eventually? So why would you put yourself in a position to look like a hypocrite in the first place? I mean, isn't that the easy part of being a world leader? Is like you've got people around you saying, be careful, don't do this. This is going to get out. The optics don't look good, so don't do this. Like they do it anyways, and they get caught. Like that's a no-brainer to me. Having a party during COVID when you told the rest of your nation not to have a house party.
Yeah, well, I actually, you're touching on something that I've often marveled at, and that is the incapacity of some of these politicians to understand that whatever they're doing, it's going to get out, it's going to get public, and it astonishes me, Chris, how some of these guys just don't get it. Do you? What makes you think you're not going to get caught?
Right.
Especially today, you know, everybody has a cell phone. Virtually everybody has a smartphone. That means that everybody is carrying around a miniature tape recorder and a high resolution video camera. Everybody.
Yeah.
You can't hide from this stuff anymore. You can't hide from the electorate or anything like that. You don't have to be perfect.
No.
I'm not looking for perfection in politicians. Okay. I'm not, to be perfectly honest, I'm not even necessarily looking for perfect honesty. People, they exaggerate, they bend the truth a little bit for whatever reasons. Okay. I had a friend once, a good friend, a lawyer, who had represented me in a number of legal cases, and he once pointed out to me, he said, Joseph, he said, there's something that you have to understand, because I was saying, oh, that person's lying, that person, impugn their integrity in that. And he said to me, he said, Joseph, he said, there's a thing that we all have to understand. That is that good people tell tall tales from time to time. It doesn't mean that they're dishonest or anything like that. It's just, they, for whatever. Anyway, but this is not what I'm talking about. So I'm not talking about, just human behavior. I'm talking about the big stuff. I'm talking about the Jimmy Swaggart. Okay, we were talking, my wife and I,
Yeah.
about Jimmy Swaggart the other night at the dinner table. How it came up was exactly this situation. Was we were talking about, didn't they know they were going to get caught? And I don't remember. We weren't talking specifically about Boris Johnson. But we were talking. I can't remember who we were speaking about. But I brought up Jimmy Swaggart, and I said, remember Jimmy Swaggart? Okay, is every week he's got his televangelist show, and he's out there and he's waving the Bible and he's pounding the desk and or the lectern, and he's saying stop sinning, walk with God, all of this stuff. At the same time that he's visiting prostitutes, he's paying for sex with prostitutes, Chris. And I'm thinking, what makes you think you're not going to get caught?
Exactly.
That's what it doesn't compute with me. I could forgive the guy. I mean, what do I care? It's his business. It's between him and his wife. Okay, I don't care. The guy went to see prostitutes. He's a pig. Okay, there it is. He pays for sex from strange women. All right. But what makes you think you're not going to get caught? That just doesn't compute for me, Chris.
Yeah,
Is it?
and
What is
you
it
have
with
to,
these guys?
yeah. There were several politicians, of course, that got caught during COVID. Jason Kenney and his famous rooftop dinner with his lunch with his guys, and that was one I thought maybe he could have gotten away with it because they're up on the rooftop, but there was somebody with a camera that was across another rooftop, I guess, and took a picture. That one I think he might have gotten away with. Then there was like in California, the California Governor Gavin Newsom going to
Right.
the French Laundry, one of the most posh restaurants in California. And not only is at a dinner, he's at a dinner with like 12 people or whatever. And I think some of them were actually health officials. So not just him, but health officials at this dinner when the average Californian was not even allowed to keep his restaurant open. For some reason, the French Laundry was open. And once again, a picture was taken. Somebody must have known that, hey, this picture is going to get out somehow. But in the case of Gavin Newsom, he never really had to pay a price for that. This guy, talk about Teflon. He does whatever he wants, and he just slides along. And now it looks like he might want to run for president. There's whispers that he's thinking of running for president. So nothing seems to stick to that guy for some reason.
Huh. How do you like that? You know, there was today, I just saw today on one of my news feeds a picture of Justin Trudeau on a train not wearing a mask and interacting with a crowd of people, none of whom are wearing masks.
Right.
And there's going to be some backlash. It was obviously a story in the media already, but to what degree is it going to be a backlash? I doubt that it's going to be a big deal. For some reason, Trudeau seems to be, as you say, a little Teflon as well. Things don't seem to stick to him that much. I mean, if you think of some of the stuff that Trudeau has been engaged in and things that have come out, you know, the blackface stuff and
Right.
and what have you, and he's been involved in a number of scandals. So it's really interesting because you can see, I think, a real difference between how liberal, small L liberal or big L liberal supporters treat their leaders and how conservative supporters treat their leaders. It seems to me that supporters of conservative leaders hold those leaders to a higher standard and are more ready to tear them down when they don't meet those standards. And I would argue that maybe they're even just the standards are just a little bit too high, and maybe those followers are maybe just a little bit too quick to tear
Right.
their leaders down. I don't know. That's sort of my sense, but
Yeah.
you don't see this with leadership on the left, and I don't know. Is that a good thing, a bad thing?
Yeah. And you brought up Trudeau and the blackface thing. At least I look at the blackface thing and thinking, well, he wasn't even an MP at the time.
That's true.
He wasn't a kid, but he wasn't, I guess he was in his 20s or whatever. So I can understand someone giving him a pass saying that was before his political life. But then you go back to last year when we had to have our flags at half-mast to recognize the plight of our indigenous people. And then in September, instead of going to Kamloops to the ceremony, he's off in Tofino having a vacation. And once again, thinking that no one's going to see him, you're not going to get caught. I couldn't believe that when I first heard that story. I thought, are you joking? This is the guy that's been telling us that we need to honor the Aboriginal people and we need to feel sorry as a nation. You kept our flag half-mast for the whole summer, and then you didn't even have the decency to go to the Kamloops ceremony on Aboriginal Day. How do you
But
get away with that?
but tell me something, Chris. That occurred before the election, correct?
I think so. I think so.
So, and it didn't seem to have any kind of an effect on the outcome of the election.
Right.
So there you go, I guess. But I hear you. It's almost like he calculates and has so far calculated correctly that he's not going to have to pay a significant political price for some of the shenanigans that he's been involved in. But going back to the idea of conservative leaders seeming to be held to a higher standard by their supporters, let's not forget that it wasn't just Boris Johnson that had to step down. Theresa May, his predecessor, had to step down over the challenges that she was facing with respect to Brexit. And then before that, David Cameron
Right.
also resigned in the aftermath of the Brexit referendum. And, these were not just leaders of the Conservative Party of Great Britain or UK Conservative Party. These were sitting prime ministers. So it's there clearly is a double standard now, and I'm not saying that the double standard. I'm not using that term as it's usually used in terms of, well, the media treats conservative leaders differently than they treat liberal leaders. That may be the case, but I think that conservative followers treat conservative leaders differently than liberal followers treat their liberal leaders as well. And I think that's an interesting phenomenon in and of itself.
Yeah, I'm thinking back to our former Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, who really had pretty well a scandal-free reign from 2006 to 2015. And the only thing that came close to a scandal, that wasn't a scandal in my mind, was the senator scandal, like with Mike Duffy. And it turned out this is one of the first in the Western world, one of the first scandals that involved somebody paying back the government, or paying back the taxpayer money that the taxpayer was owed. And like, this is a scandal, like who was the sneaky person that paid the money back. It's like that if that's the only scandal that you have in your decade-long career as a prime minister or president, that's not too bad.
Isn't that typically Canadian, though? But of course, nothing like that would have happened. Remember the everything around the sponsorship scandal back when Jean Chrétien was the prime minister. I mean, he eventually was ousted by his finance minister, former finance minister, Paul Martin. Yeah. But not he didn't go down because of the sponsorship scandal and the paper bags full of money and all of that stuff. I mean, people went to jail over some of the stuff that went on in that scandal, but it didn't. The Liberals didn't insist on their leader resigning. So, it's there's a very clear in my mind double standard here. And again, maybe it's not fair to call it a double standard because we're not talking about conservatives holding one group. We're not talking about one group holding somebody more accountable than the other. Although maybe liberal supporters hold conservative leaders up to a higher standard. I don't know. But it's a fascinating thing. But it's tough. It's look, politics is not easy. It's never been easy because you really aren't making colossal decisions that affect people's life, historical decisions. And you do the best you can. And this is the thing about politicians, irrespective of what side of the political spectrum they happen to occupy, they're still just human beings. They put their pants on one leg at a time in the morning, just like the rest of us. And there's nothing particularly special about them. So you hope that they have good judgment. You hope that the people around them also have good judgment. But in the final analysis, they're just human beings and they're making decisions. And sometimes the decisions are right and sometimes they're wrong. And so I have always had a certain amount of respect and sympathy, even for the difficult job that political leaders have to do, and that extends to leaders from all political persuasions. It's not easy being a political leader. It's not an easy job being in politics in general, but to put yourself out there to be in a leadership capacity, it's especially difficult. It takes a certain amount of chutzpah, if you will, and and yeah, it's a real challenge.
Yeah. But they do. I want to cut them some slack, but on the other hand, when you get to a certain level, whether you're a mayor or premier, a cabinet minister, when you get to those positions, you do have people around you though to consult with and to help you. And you always have a person that you can look to and say, look, I want to do this, or I'm about to make this decision. What do you think? Is this ethical? Am I going to get in trouble doing this? Certainly the people around you should be seasoned and experienced enough to say, Mr. Mayor, Mr. Premier, I don't think we should do this. Like, if you're not going to listen to the people, if you don't surround yourself with good people, let me put it the other way. If you surround yourself with good people that you trust and you say to them, I don't know, I might not know all the rules. I'm not a walking encyclopedia or the best policy wonk, but I know you people are. So before I put my foot into the mud, let me know if we can do this. Um, just recently, for example, the situation with Patrick Brown and the conservative leadership. Now, I don't expect Patrick Brown to have his finger in everything in his leadership campaign. It's a leadership campaigns involve a lot of people, but shouldn't he know what was happening in his campaign to stay squeaky clean? So how can you not make sure that everybody working on your campaign not only knows what the rules are, but make sure that they're following each rule right to the letter? I mean, that's you bring people on board your team to make sure that you're following all the rules. You don't have to know all the rules, but you do have to know who knows the rules so that you don't step in it at the wrong time.
Yeah, it's a good point, well taken, Chris. And of course, Patrick now is just announced that he's going to be running for mayor, re-election for re-election as mayor of the city of Brampton, and they're undergoing a lot of turmoil there on their city council as well. So um, I don't know. As somebody far wiser than me once said, it sucks to be him.
Yeah.
Uh,
I see a comment here from Craig, and he makes a good point. He says that there is an ethics. He says, ethics. We have an ethics commissioner to set you straight. You have to have the wherewithal to approach him or her. So right, that's true. It's like I spent several years in the government, and they always said to us, if you're not sure about something, go to your ethics person in your department and ask them. Talk to your manager. If their manager doesn't know, they can consult with the ethics person before you make a decision on something. That's a good
yeah,
point.
I have to tell you though, I'm not a big fan of the whole, or believer in the whole thing about ethics commissioners and ethics rules, etc. I mean, of
Yeah.
course, I believe in ethics, okay, but the idea that we codify ethics and then we have an ethics commissioner that we go to for rulings and stuff like that, and sometimes I think to myself, oughtn't we be able to figure some of this stuff out ourselves? And
Yeah.
if I'm gonna, if I'm thinking this is potentially a bad thing to do, I probably am not going to do it anyway. But what we're doing in politics in particular now is we say, well, I know this goes against your better judgment. You clearly have something in the back of your mind that's telling you don't do this. It's not really kosher. if I could use that term. But then you go, okay, well, maybe I'll just check with the ethics commissioner. The ethics commissioner comes back and says, well, there's nothing in the code of conduct about this, which is what the commissioner talks about. Okay, it's not really ethics. It's what's written as ethics in the code of conduct. There's nothing in the code of conduct preventing you from doing this. So it must be, quote unquote, yes, you guessed it, ethical, which of course it probably isn't. But you're going to get away with doing it anyway, because after all, you got a green light from the ethics commissioner. So I think that the whole area of ethics in politics, codified ethics in politics and in business, I think is I think it misses the point by a wide margin. The fact is, if you have to have a code of conduct telling you how to be decent and respectful to your colleagues, your fellow workers in a work environment, then you're in big trouble already. This is stuff that you should already know, and if you don't know it, then no code of ethics is ever going to teach you to internalize this decent behavior, so that you're not behaving like a cad, or worse. So this is one of the problems, and this is a bigger subject altogether, Chris, and it is, what kind of a society have we created where we actually have to have codes of conduct to determine whether or not we're behaving, decently, and behaving honestly, and behaving, to use the term, ethically, and somehow or other, if it's not prohibited, then it must be okay, and I just think that's a terrible lesson to be teaching our children.
Yeah, I agree. And there are certain situations where I can understand where, even like when the prime minister, when he went to the vacation with the Aga Khan, well, maybe you might not know. It's like, oh, he's a friend of the family, and I went on vacation and I was invited there, so I can even see where a person could credibly say, I didn't realize that was an ethics violation because I was visiting somebody that was a so-called friend of mine. So, yeah.
Yeah, honestly, Chris, I'm going to hear about this. I'm going to hear back on. I actually don't think that the prime minister did such a bad thing when he went on that vacation with the Aga Khan. I don't. He's a family friend. Okay, what were taxpayers' resources, tax dollars used in order to finance the vacation? I don't know if they were. That's problematic, but I didn't have a problem with him going on vacation with these guys, even if they're doing business with the government, which is the flip side to this. It's a double-edged sword, because, you have this code of conduct, and then you have other politicians in the opposition who are going to be scrutinizing your behavior and then going, okay, this doesn't fit what's permissible. Therefore, you've violated some sort of an ethics rule, and so you get this whole game played around what's written down and what's not written down, and good sound judgment and decent behavior actually never ever enter into the equation.
True. I guess we're hitting the top of the hour, so we're
getting pretty close to the top of the hour. So that first hour just went rattling by really fast. Okay, so we'll be back in a few minutes here on the Nick and Joe Show with our guest host tonight, Chris Fraser.
We all know that climate change is real, but with countries like China and India failing to do their part, what Canadians need now more than ever is a Made in Canada climate change plan. A real plan that responds to the real-world needs of Canadians. A balanced plan that supports responsible economic growth and strengthens our essential infrastructure. a responsible plan that protects our natural environment and ensures that all Canadians enjoy the blessings of clean air, clean land, and clean water for generations to come. It's time for Canadian politicians to show real leadership in the world, putting partisanship and ideology aside. It's time for a sensible climate plan. We're the International Climate Science Coalition Canada, and we're ready to help. To learn more, visit our website, icsc-canada.com.
Okay, welcome back once again to hour number 2 of the Nick and Joe Show. I'm Joe, and
I'm
we're
Chris.
joined tonight not by Chris. Long day, Chris. Long day. Not by Nick, but we're joined tonight with our guest host, Chris Fraser. And if you've been watching and following the Nick and Joe Show over the last few years, Chris is familiar to you. Although I don't think we have you on, as I said earlier, enough, Chris. We should get you on when Nick is on as well. And the three of us have had some fun in the past when we've done that, the three of us on the show. So anyway, what am I looking at here? Let's see. I am going to... What is it Craig is saying there? What did Craig say?
Oh, Craig says the Canadian...
I knew I was going to get blasted.
The Canadian government gives him millions of dollars. I guess by him he means Trudeau. Millions of dollars every year. An MP isn't allowed to be entertained any longer by anyone seeking funds from the government.
I think he's talking about the Aga Khan.
You're right, yeah.
Yeah, fair enough, Chris. Except, yeah, okay. I'm not gonna dispute what you're saying. It's I hear you, and as I said, I knew that I knew I was going to get subjected to criticism for that, and it's a fair criticism, by the way, not like people criticizing me for being too liberal because I happened to get a COVID vaccine back last year, which I've been accused of. Okay, and I'm thinking, okay, man, really? You're accusing me of being a liberal? Goodness gracious me. Anyway, so the Bank of Canada or the government or whomever is following these statistics announced that we now are a little north of 8% inflation rate, which we haven't seen in this country for almost 40 years. And it's funny, I have to tell you that this inflation growth in the rate of inflation kind of snuck up on us, didn't it? It was, this time last year, although there were people who were going, we're going to have a period of inflation soon. There were definitely those people out there who were making that kind of prediction. But I don't think people really followed it or thought about it or cared about it. And then bang, here it is. And we're now at 8% and likely still climbing. And so it's inflation is not new. It's, in fact, inflation has kind of been baked into the way the government runs monetary policy. And in fact, there's an agreement between the government of Canada and the Bank of Canada that the Bank of Canada aims for something around a 2%. I think it's 2% inflation rate,
Sounds
yep, and you know, certain politicians, Maxime Bernier would be one of them, has pointed out repeatedly that that's a tax on savings. Because just think about it, okay? If you're achieving a target of 2% inflation every year as a matter of policy, then what you're basically doing is you're devaluing people's savings by 2% a year. So over 10 years, you lose 20% of the value of your savings. And if you're on fixed income, on retired with fixed income, that over a period of time can be quite significant. So inflation is not new, and in fact, we've had a policy, I think, of inducing inflation to a certain degree here in this country. But 8% is starting to get pretty high up there, and
sure.
yeah. So
I see a comment from Craig here. It says, "You can't have the Bank of Canada printing billions of dollars injected into the economy without inflation. It happened while Pierre Trudeau was in power." So it's
it's
yeah,
true.
it's repeating itself.
One of the things that I have found really surprising is how quickly we seem to have abandoned the lessons that we learned during the last major inflationary period that we had, which was in fact the 1970s and early 80s, and which was largely the result of poor fiscal management on the part of governments around the world, Western governments in particular. And it wasn't until Margaret Thatcher came to power in the United Kingdom, and then later Ronald Reagan, perhaps to a somewhat lesser degree, adopted what was considered to be called monetary policy. And to boil monetary policy down into its most simple, basic, uncomplicated terms, it involves controlling the supply of money. In other words, what you want to do is you want to ensure that price stability is achieved not not by having laws to control incomes, but rather having policy to control the amount of money that you're, as Craig mentions, injecting into the economy. And so, if you can control that, and you can keep spending at a relatively stable pace, then you should be able to control inflation. And that was kind of the lesson, that it was a radical approach to handling inflation, but we really, really licked the problem in the 1980s, and into the 90s. It was pretty bad for a while. I've said on this show, Chris, the first car that I bought, I had to pay for a used car. I had to pay somewhere around 23-24% interest on my car loan.
Can't believe
Um, and so and the prime interest rate, as if I don't have the numbers in front of me, but the Bank of Canada rates, were sitting in the 10, 11, 12% range. So yeah, it's been a little surprising to me how quickly we abandoned the discipline and the lessons that led to us adopting that disciplined approach to monetary policy, that we just sort of threw it out. And somebody was saying recently, well, we're all Keynesians now. And I'm like, yeah, no, we're not all Keynesians now. But, as Keynes himself pointed out, when somebody pointed out to him that his monetary policy, or his fiscal policies, didn't really work in the long run, his response was, "You may be right, but in the long run, we're all dead."
right.
I don't know if that's apocryphal or if that's an actual quote from him. It certainly was attributed to him as something he was responding to in a debate with, I think, Frederick Hayek. So I don't know if it's true or not, but it's certainly, it's a good story.
Yeah. I think that we like to talk about politics, and how politicians rule over us. I think part of the problem here is like the populace, by and large, at least the people I know, people I talk to on a regular basis, just casually, they don't seem to be really that concerned with inflation, and they don't put the blame on the government. I'm not saying that we've got to put the blame on the government for everything, but they don't seem to understand. Like going back to Craig's comment about the government printing money. When you print money, I mean, I just went upstairs for a drink, and I walked by the kitchen table, and I noticed like that my little check, my climate change check came in this week. So it's amazing how many people will see that check and they say, "Oh wow, I got 80, 90, whatever dollars from the government because the government really wants to help me out and the government is on my side." It's amazing how many people don't see that that is not free money, that it has to come from somewhere. And it's amazing how people don't see how inflation eats into their savings. And it's not as if the government can't do anything about it when it comes to, I mean, a lot of this is tied into the gas prices. We're paying more for gas. Or are we paying more for gas because we're not energy independent like we should be? And so if you start to connect the dots, then you'll see that the government has a hand in this, but people are not connecting those dots. They just live for today, and whatever happens, happens. So there's just there's too few of us in the electorate who actually are paying attention to these things and saying, let me connect the dots here. But most people are just kind of like, yeah, whatever. I just keep, living my life.
Yeah, well, but that's the way it is. Just generally, it's not just on inflation; it's just about everything. I mean, people, as you say, they're just living their lives, and they really only become stirred when something happens that directly impacts their day-to-day lives, that knocks them off course, that that is right in front of their faces, uh, and uh, and in a negative way. And you're not going to get a whole lot of people that are going to say, "Huh, climate change check. Thank you very much, Justin Trudeau. I'll be putting that in the bank, and I'll be putting that in the bank because I've noticed my grocery prices have been going up lately."
Right.
So um, uh, it's a problem, and it's not a new problem, and but it's what's new is that government is involved in so many aspects of our lives that the capacity for government to really harm us is very, very great. To really have negative consequences for society and individuals that comprise that society, it's the government that really has an amazing capacity for doing harm, but
Yeah.
only harm in very small increments.
Yes.
and and so it's sort of like the frog in the water, okay, in the pot
Right.
on the stove in the pot. You put, and for those who don't know the story, if you have a boiling pot of water and you throw the frog in, the frog jumps out like that. But if you put the pot of water on and it's cold, and you put the frog in, the frog's just relaxing and turn the heat up, the frog's going to die. He's going to boil to death
Right. Yeah.
because he doesn't notice that the incremental increase in temperature, and that's part of the problem. That's part of the problem with silly, crazy spending by the government is that when the government comes and says, "Well, we're going to spend $1 billion," or we're going to spend. Let's make the math really, really simple. We're going to spend $40 million on this project. And everybody in the country looks at the project and go, that is stupid. That is kooky. It's insane. It makes no difference. We should not be spending that kind of money, any money on any of this stuff. Okay. But here's the problem. The problem is that for taxpayers, you're not spending $40 million. You're spending $1 per taxpayer. So
Right.
if we got rid of that whole program, hypothetically, whatever it is, it wouldn't make a difference to anybody. And so that's the game that gets played, and it's a game that's not played purposely necessarily. It's just the way it is. The government does so many things now. It's so big, and it's got its fingers into so many things, most of which we would probably disapprove of. But if you start cutting back those things, it doesn't make a difference to people. So the government is going to be more inclined to give the money to the individuals and the small groups that $40 million really makes a difference to. Why? Because if they don't give the money, then those groups go to the press and it becomes a big story, and all of a sudden the population is hearing this government is uncaring, they're short-sighted, or they're whatever the criticism is, and that does more harm to the long-term prospects of a government than taking that dollar from an individual taxpayer.
Right.
I don't know how you overcome this. It's a serious.
It's a problem because, right, nobody wants to say no to something that's given to them, but I think people like you and I realize that, yeah, I would, that check that's sitting up on my kitchen table, like it makes me feel good in a way, but it's not really helping me all that much. I would rather, give that check back to the government and say, could you do something about the price of gas? Could you take a little bit, could you reduce the tax on the gas so that I'd be saving more than $80, over the course of a year? That makes more economical sense to me. But for a lot of people, they want that piece of paper that says, here's some money we're giving you. Like, reduce my taxes and I'll have more money in my pocket. Thank you very much. And I can manage that money better than the government can manage it for me. That's my attitude.
Well, yeah, and I think you're absolutely right, Chris, and I wish more people thought that way. And even if you're a Keynesian, okay, even if you're a Keynesian and you believe in injecting money into the economy to get it going, okay, uh, the fact is that cutting taxes does inject money into the economy,
Right.
or more precisely, you're refraining from withdrawing that money from the economy in the first place. So there's more money floating around out there, and as a consequence of that, you're going to have, presumably, you'll have greater economic activity. But there is a danger in that. There is a danger, and again, I'm not against doing that. I'm just saying that when you're out of whack, okay, when things are out of balance, that if you suddenly cut taxes, okay, and people start spending a lot of money, now you have a supply side problem, which is inflationary. So, this is just an example of how challenging and how difficult it is once you start to get into these periods of inflation. How you lick the problem it's a real challenge, and quite often it can be quite painful for the society that's having to overcome the challenge to get inflation under control, which again is this is why they're raising interest rates. You don't raise interest rates in order to keep pace with inflation. And as a matter of policy, okay, the Bank of Canada raises interest rates to discourage spending, okay, which ought to have some positive impact on inflation, because then you have a somewhat reduced demand on what is a limited supply of goods, so, or services. So uh, it's complicated. It's a big challenge. Um, but I can't. I'm looking at the clock and I'm thinking to myself, I can't let the moment pass without pointing out that what we're seeing in the general economy right now, in terms of inflation, this is the way we've been running healthcare in this country for the past half a century.
Right.
Is that is we operate under the fiction, the fantasy that you control prices by having a rule or a set of prices, and this is how we keep the price of healthcare under control. When in fact, when you keep prices down artificially, okay, what you do is you actually end up creating more demand. And by the way, we have the perfect storm in healthcare because we don't charge people for healthcare, period, in this country. So you have virtually unlimited demand, and the unlimited demand, as any first-year economics student will tell you, is an inflationary situation. So you have unlimited demand, and supply can't keep up with it. So what our governments do is they limit the supply further by imposing price controls, or in fact basically saying we're not going to provide this service at all. So you have limited service or rationed service, at the same time that you have a rationed supply. At the same time you have unlimited demand. Okay, and then you're surprised because prices, the pressure for rising costs in healthcare, it seems to be almost irresistible. Well, I hate to say it, but the only way you can beat this is you have to impose some market discipline, predominantly on the demand side. I think I'm not an economic guru or anything like that, but I think that what you have to do is you have to find a way to reduce some of the demand on our healthcare system, and that comes with charging people some sort of a fee if you want to maintain the healthcare system. And we didn't want to. This is a somewhat different topic than inflation, but the principles and the trends that we see in the general economy now have been in play as a matter of policy within our healthcare system for the better part of 2 generations now, and we've gotten to the point now where we are on the verge potentially of a collapse of our healthcare system, simply because we don't have the doctors and the nurses and the technicians in order to service the demand that's out there for those services. We just don't have them, and so people are not getting proper health care, and the response to the government is ration some more, or maybe that's not even the policy, but that's the effect, is you have to ration the services.
So are you suggesting, Joseph, it's a complicated thing. Are you suggesting, for example, when someone has to go to a walk-in clinic, that they should have to pay $10 or $15 for the visit, just to contribute something and to make sure that they're not going in unnecessarily? Is that kind of what you're moving toward?
Yeah, I have no brief on this. I'm not advising any politicians or any political parties on the subject. This is just you and me having a conversation as private citizens. But my guess is that if you had some kind of a user fee, that would go a long way towards imposing some kind of discipline, market discipline, on the industry. You have to look at patients as consumers. After all,
Right.
they are healthcare consumers, and the rules of consumption and supply and demand apply in healthcare just as they do in any other area of economic activity. And so, I think that would go a long way. And of course, what you'll end up having is people saying, well, if you charge somebody $5 or $10 for a doctor's visit, then they may not get to go and see the doctor. And of course, everybody's going to go, that's a terrible thing. Except it's not a terrible thing. How many times are people going to see a doctor and using a valuable resources, time, etc., for little or no reason? Um, you know, but again, it's so complicated, Chris, because now we're talking about healthcare in isolation from everything else in society. But we have a nanny state. People are worried about Big Brother. Okay, everyone talks about Big Brother. Our problem isn't Big Brother. Our problem is Big Mother. That's
Yeah.
the problem we have in our society today, where parents don't seem to be able to handle just general common illnesses for their children. No, I mean, and that's a general statement. Of course, it doesn't apply to everybody, but your child has a cough. Maybe they just have a cold, or maybe they have just a bit of an allergy. I don't know. Do you have to go to the clinic? And at night, do you have to go to the emergency room? And because your child happens to have the sniffles, I don't know, and I know I'm coming across as unfeeling and hard-hearted, etc. And that certainly isn't my intention. And this is why I said it's really a bigger problem than just the economics of healthcare. We're circling, come full circle. We're back to that. What's the point of the federal government or any government monitoring and issuing heat warnings? Like, do I need the government to tell me it's hot out in order to know that it's hot out? I
Right.
I can read the thermometer. Okay, I know when it's hot and it's 30 degrees. Slow it down a little bit. Make sure you got water with you. Stay in the shade. If you can
Yeah.
stay in some air conditioned environment, all the better.
Yeah.
I don't need the government warning me that there's a heat crisis in order to do this. But for some reason, we've created a whole department to monitor the heat, the weather, and to issue heat warnings when it's hot outside.
Right.
I don't get it, Chris.
You know,
I
I
just don't
was
get
listening
it.
to Randall Denley. I think you know Randall.
Sure.
He was on a talk show earlier this week, and he pointed out something that I thought, gee, that's obvious. I never realized that before. That when it comes to healthcare, he says, why can't we have like smaller healthcare clinics in neighborhoods like we do with dental offices? Because I realized like here in Blackburn Hamlet, it's just like a small place. I don't know, maybe there's like 8 or 9,000 people that live here in the hamlet. And we have 3 dental
Yeah.
offices right within about a kilometer of each other.
I,
And I'm thinking, how come we can have that 3 dental offices, but we couldn't have like a walk-in clinic where you actually have to pay, 25 or
so
$30 to get something stitched up or whatever.
so
It's
So I have that. It's a great question, Chris, and I
like,
have an answer to it. Okay, the answer to it is that that's the way it used to be. Okay, This idea of clinics where you had 5 or 6 or 7 doctors coming together to pool resources, that was unheard of when not just when I was a child, but even as a young adult. That really the fact is the reason that we don't have the same kind of proliferation, if you will, of doctors as we have dentists is simply because of the economics of it. The government does not step in and say to dentists, you can only earn so much per dental visit by law, and not only that, but you can only earn so much every year as a dentist, irrespective of how many patients you see. And so, but we do both of those to our doctors. So it's frankly, it's not economically possible for an individual doctor to open up his own individual practice on a street corner today in this, certainly in this province, because they don't earn enough money to be able to do that. So the only way you could do it is on a scale of economy where you're seeing 100 patients a day, and you can't do that as one doctor. So you end up going into business with a handful of doctors. But even then, the government caps what you as a doctor can earn every year. So if I'm working 6 or 7 hours a day, I might work as a doctor seeing patients 12 months of the year. But if I'm working like crazy and I'm saying I want to earn as much as possible, or even better, for altruistic reasons, I'm going to go out there and I want to care for every sick person in my community. And if I have to work 16 hours a day, then that's what I'm going to do. Okay, so I go out and I do that, but eventually I'm going to reach my cap, and now I can't I can't bill the government insurance program anymore because I've reached my cap. And so what am I going to do? Well, if I'm a smart person, I'll work 8 months out of the year and take 4 months off, or I'll work 11 months and take a month off, or whatever it is. So now the system is actually even contributing not only to a rationing of the service, but to the reduction in the number of doctors that are available in order to treat patients. So it's our healthcare crisis, to the degree that it's a crisis, is 100% self-inflicted. It's government inflicted. But it's a tough nut to crack. You've got to convince people of that, and I'm not sure that you can convince people of it, because most people don't spend 11 hours in the waiting room at a hospital with a broken leg, because most people don't have broken legs. So
Exactly.
you care about it when it happens to you. When it doesn't happen to you, it's just something that's in the back of your mind. You may have heard something or other about it. Chris, I'm seeing we've gone over time here, so let's take our last break. We'll be back in a few minutes if that's okay with you.
Sure thing. See you soon.
So back in a couple of minutes here on the Nick and Joe Show with our guest host, Chris Fraser.
We all know that climate change is real. But with countries like China and India failing to do their part, what Canadians need now more than ever is a Made in Canada climate change plan. A real plan that responds to the real-world needs of Canadians. A balanced plan that supports responsible economic growth and strengthens our essential infrastructure. A responsible plan that protects our natural environment and ensures that all Canadians enjoy the blessings of clean air, clean land, and clean water for generations to come. It's time for Canadian politicians to show real leadership in the world, putting partisanship and ideology aside. It's time for a sensible climate plan. We're the International Climate Science Coalition Canada, and we're ready to help. To learn more, visit our website, icsc-canada.com.
Oh, welcome back. You're into the home stretch, or at least we're into the home stretch here on the Nick and Joe Show. I'm Joe, and Chris Fraser is sitting in for Nick Vandergraat tonight as Nick entertains a bevy of beer-drinking friends and relatives. I don't know whether that's the case. I shouldn't poke fun at Nick. Nick,
He's allowed.
Maybe Nick might actually be watching. Hey, Nick, if
Yeah,
you're watching.
actually, he said he might be joining in this. He might be watching the show, so we'll be careful what we say about him.
So, Nick is not going to object to me saying that he's drinking beer or something else. Maybe. So, and if this C11 passes, will we be able to drink alcohol while we're on the internet during doing a live show? I don't know.
Yeah, I
I
guess it
do
depends
not.
what province you're in. If you're in the Buck of Beer, Ontario with Doug Ford, maybe you can do it. I don't know.
I don't know a buck of beer. Gosh, I'm telling
No one
you,
talks about that anymore. That's an old policy.
that's an old policy. Anyway, Chris, let's Nick and I wanted to talk a little bit about this last week, and we got sidetracked into a number of other issues, and yeah, the Canada and Justin Trudeau in particular has been criticized fairly harshly for agreeing to return to Russia it's a turbine. I'm not 100% sure what its particular use was. It has to do with the supply of natural gas to Europe, to Germany in particular, um, and um, and it was here in Canada being repaired. And the Russians basically said, well, unless we have this turbine, we're not going to be able to supply natural gas to Germany. And so the Canadian government went ahead, notwithstanding all of the sanctions around the Ukraine war, etc. The Canadian government went ahead and returned the turbine to Russia. So a lot of people have been criticizing the government for that. And my personal view is I think I give the government a pass on it. I understand the frustration, but the request, my understanding is, came from Germany itself, from the government in Germany, because they are now staring at a winter potentially without having the kind of fuel that they need to heat their country. And Germany is not the coldest country in the world, but it requires fuel to heat buildings and houses during the winter months, and Germany gets its supply of natural gas from Russia. So it's very easy to argue about sanctions, and my understanding is that the government of Ukraine now is quite upset with Canada for having taken the position that it did with respect to this turbine. But I'm not really sure what exactly that we could have done differently.
I agree with you. I'm not an expert on this issue, but it does make sense. You can't Canada and the Western world is doing their best to put sanctions on Russia, but at the same time, yeah, you want to punish Russia, but you can't punish your allies by punishing Russia. So, you're talk about being between a rock and a hard place. I agree with you. I give the government a pass on this, but let us be clear that there's only so much we can do to punish Russia. I don't think we've really been punishing Russia um, the way we'd like to think we are. So that I think the government and the media makes it seem as if, yeah, we're really going hard at Russia. We're not, we're not. McDonald's is closing their restaurants. Ooh, that's really going to hurt them. I
Some
mean, or we're
people
not
would
buying
argue
Russian
that that's going to help them.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. But sanctions can work, but in this situation, now I do hear that Russia is suffering their war. Sometimes we forget it costs money to run a war, right? And sometimes we forget that. We just think that Russia has tons of missiles that they just send in, and they've got so much more. But it's expensive to run a war, and Russia is starting to run out of money apparently. So the money makes the world go around, and unfortunately, wars are fueled by money. So Russia is suffering a little bit financially in that respect, but tell that to the Ukraine people. When you see those um, scenes of buildings being burned out and people having to take shelter in subways, it's no consolation to the people of Ukraine um, that the West is supposedly sanctioning Russia, but it doesn't seem to be stopping Russia from taking over parts of the Ukraine.
This is a perfect example of something that I've pointed out in the past, and that is that when you have strong economic ties with potential enemies, that really, especially an enemy like the Russians, the government in Russia and the Russian society, where they don't necessarily react to sanctions as we would. For instance, you want the whole idea of imposing sanctions is to impose some hardships on either the population or the government, or the government through the population. And in order for that to happen, you have to have a government, you have to have a population that's actually going to experience hardships as a result of the sanctions. That's A, and B, a government that actually cares whether or not their people are suffering as a result of sanctions. And in the case of Russia, and I suspect if it ever came down to it in the case of China, we don't have those conditions. And so what ends up happening is you create strong economic ties with these governments, and if the government then these governments then act in a manner that is unacceptable, as in the case of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, then when you impose sanctions, the people who are going to actually suffer are going to be people right here in Canada or in the West, and our governments, our people, I suspect, are somewhat less inclined to accept the suffering that would be induced by sanctions on these governments. And certainly our countries, our governments, are less inclined to tolerate whatever the result or the consequence of that suffering amongst their population. So I've always felt that the argument of increasing economic activity with rogue regimes has been not a very well thought through policy. And the argument being that if we have these strong economic ties, then we're going to, through cultural exchanges that come along with economic exchange, we're going to somehow or other create or help to cultivate an environment where human rights are more respected, etc., because that's how we do things here. So they'll learn from our example, both in terms of free markets and human rights and political rights. That's the argument. And then that's A, and B, if they go offside and they don't follow through with what we think or they behave badly, then we can always impose sanctions. And the more economic activity we're doing with them, the more pain it's going to cause them. Therefore, the more likely they are, A, not to behave badly, or B, once they behave badly, to get their act together if we impose these sanctions. Well, in fact, the opposite is the case, as I say. And I think that this is a good illustration of that. We should be. There's no reason why our Western European allies, and I guess I have to say our European allies now, it's not just Western European allies, should be dependent on Russia for their fuel needs, for their energy needs. They should either be self-sufficient, which is a really difficult thing for them to do, or they should be getting their energy from places like Canada or the United States. I mean, we have the capacity to be able to supply virtually all of the energy needs of our European allies, but we don't have the ability to get that energy, the fuel, there for a lot of reasons that have to do with government policy and the government's war on oil and gas and coal. So it's it's again, so much of this stuff is complicated, but I think if there's any lesson to be learned here, I think the lesson you have to learn here is that when the Russians are ready to join the community of nations as an equal partner, as an equal in terms of religious freedom, economic freedom, political freedom, etc. And we see that that's become deeply embedded in the society, as we see in places like Japan or places like Germany. Okay, um, uh, until that happens, you can't get into bed with them, and the same thing with China. Until that happens, and it hasn't happened yet, then you're taking a huge risk getting into bed with them.
Right. Well, there's two things here that I think people in the West need to understand. First of all, the idea that we don't need fossil fuels. You hear the environmentalists saying we just need to get off of fossil fuels, and fossil fuels are not the future. Well, through this situation, you can see that fossil fuels are important, and fossil fuels are actually helping Russia to fuel their war efforts.
Yeah.
Now, Craig just
No pun intended.
that's right. Yes. No, Craig just posted something, and he said that Russia's economy is less than Canada. Oh yeah, Craig says, let's remember that Russia's economy is smaller than Canada's. This war is costing Russia. Okay, but Russia still is an energy power, and energy it's a tool. Energy. We just can't say goodbye to fossil fuels because people will die. You have to heat your home. You have to put gas in your car. So it's not as simple as saying let's get rid of fossil fuels. So, but that's what you hear environmentalists in the Western countries always saying, especially in Canada, United States. It's like, well, the world still needs fossil fuels. So that's one lesson to be learned from this. And what's also sad is that we have seen on the news. Not everybody in Russia agrees with the war effort. The problem is when Russians go to the Red Square and try to protest, they are met by police who take them away. So the lesson is you do what you go against the state, you're going to pay the price. So obviously Putin doesn't care about the people. He's not worried about getting their votes in the next election because Russia, doesn't seem to be the kind of state where I don't know if you can say they even have fair elections. If you're an opponent of Putin, you're not going to get very far. So it's not like a Western nation where, at least in the Western nations, we can say, well, if the government is not acting properly, we have ways to punish them, which is to throw them out. It's hard to throw out a Putin or the Chinese emperor, certainly, or North Korea. You can't throw these people out. Even if the population doesn't like them, they're very hard to get rid of. It's not like here in North America. So this also highlights why democracy is so important, why every vote counts, and why we should cherish democracy. I want to go back to the whole trucker convoy thing. It's like people want to have a voice, and people need to have a voice. And if Russia were like a Western country where people say we don't like what direction you're going in, keep it up, and you won't be president anymore. At least there'd be something to hang your hat on there. But when it comes to authoritarian countries, they don't have to worry about what the population thinks. Like they dictate what you're going to do.
Yeah, absolutely, and there's no surprise here. This is not, whether it was fair to predict that the Russians were going to actually engage in an invasion of the Ukraine is a separate question altogether. Some people predicted they would, some people predicted that they wouldn't. But what's not a question is the type of regime that Putin leads. Russia is not a free country. It is not, they don't have the same political rights. Their elections are not free elections. and their economy is not a free economy. And if you don't have a free economy, you don't have freedom. Period. And so there are serious problems with the Russians and have been all along. The freedom has not taken root and grown and flourished in Russia with the downfall of communism. They've dabbled in it. It may, when I say it hasn't taken root, it hasn't taken root strongly. There may be some places where it is, but generally speaking, this is just the way that Russia is. They don't have to be an enemy. We don't have to consider them to be an enemy. We don't have to consider them to be an opponent. But as Winston Churchill once said about some of the more unsavory regimes in the Middle East, he said these countries can never be friends as they stand now of British democracy, but we still have to have correct relations with them. And so
Right.
you don't have to be friends with Russia in order to have correct and diplomatic relations with them and to
Right.
treat them respectfully as a sovereign country. But we seem to think that we have to I keep using the analogy of getting into bed with them, or the cliche, get into bed with them. You can't, you don't just jump into bed with these guys. They're not our friends. They may not be our friends in our lifetime. That's the way it is.
Yeah.
There are lots of people that are not my friends. That doesn't make them my enemy, and it doesn't mean that I'm going to go to war with them and I'm going to compete with them, unless, of course, they're exporting their retrograde political ideas. But the Russians aren't doing that right now. They did under the communist regime, but they aren't really doing it right now. So
Right.
again, you have to find that middle ground. And if there's anyone that has to answer for bad policy in this whole fiasco, it has to be the governments of Western European countries that put their trust into a country that is not stable and is not free and does not adhere to the kind of values that bind us together as small L liberal Western democracies.
Craig has a comment here. He says Trump warned Germany and the rest of Europe against Russian gas.
That's true. He did.
So, okay. Thanks for that, Craig. That's a very important contribution. I know there might not be a lot of Trump fans in your neighborhood or my neighborhood, Joseph, but we weren't dealing with these things 2 or 3 years ago, were we? When Trump was in power, Putin was invading Ukraine back. He had 4 years to do it under Trump. He never invaded the Ukraine then. Now people say, oh, because he was chummy with Trump. It's like, well, hey, I think if the Ukrainian people would have preferred that right now to go back to where they were 2 or 3 years ago, as compared to the situation that they face right now, when the USA was energy independent under Trump. I mean, that only made sense to me.
Yeah.
But now the bad orange man is gone, and now we have this situation.
Yeah, and I don't know how long this is going to last. It's I'm not. I don't have a horse in the race. I'm not American. I'm not living in the United States, so I'm not going to pass judgment on how they conduct their politics and stuff like that. They're going to do what they're going to do, for better or worse. Having said that, though, I mean, just as a neutral observer, how can you possibly look at the way that the president of the United States right now, Joe Biden, is behaving and not be troubled, and not think to yourself, well, how are the Americans going to deal with this? I don't know. Maybe they'll just muddle along for the next 2 years, but it's pretty clear to me that Joe Biden is suffering from some incapacities that are making it very difficult for him to discharge all of the duties and responsibilities of the President of the United States. And I dare say that that was probably part of the calculation that Putin made when he was making his decision to initiate this invasion. And it's, you have to think that the government in China is watching the situation closely as well,
Right.
and thinking to itself, what should our policy, or what can we get away with respect to our neighboring countries, and in particular with respect to Taiwan? If the Chinese were to invade Taiwan, would the Americans under Joe Biden defend Taiwan? I think it's an open question. With Trump, it was an open question as well, but it was in a sense, it was an even more open question.
Yeah.
Donald Trump was unpredictable.
Right.
And as such, unpredictability can have a very deterring effect. So I don't think that people feared Trump because they feared his iron determination and they knew where he stood. I think quite the opposite. I think that it was very hard to say where Trump stood on some of these things, and he was very mercurial and very erratic and unpredictable. And I think that itself has a very strong deterrent effect.
Right. And going back to this segment we were talking about an hour or two ago, about who you surround yourself with. You look at the people that Joe Biden has surrounded himself with. His presidency might not be so bad. His approval rating might be higher if he had said, I'm going to surround myself with people who really care about the country, who want the best for the USA, who want the USA to be still the most powerful, most influential country in the world. Instead, he has surrounded himself with these ideologues who are, some of them are actually anti-American. They're anti-fossil fuel. They're anti-Western values, and it's just turning into a big mess. And it doesn't have to be that way. But once again, as a leader, you have the choice, at least, to surround yourself with people who are going to give you the proper direction and the proper advice. And he's just listening to the wrong people. And there are people in that Democratic Party at the top who are just giving him bad advice. And he's, as one guy said, he's like the driver in the getaway car. It's just like, drive the car here, Joe, park it here. We'll see you later. Just do what we tell you to do. That's oversimplistic, but he's he's listening to the wrong people, and it's getting his country and the world into a great big mess.
And with that, we're going to have to leave it. Just want to say, Chris, that if you get a call from the Biden White House looking for you to come down and give them some sound, common sense advice, I recommend that you take the position.
Yeah, I'll wait for that phone call. I got the red phone here, just handy, just in case.
Okay. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining in. It's been an exciting and an effervescent 2 hours. I want to thank our guest host this week, Chris Fraser, for taking the time almost at the last minute to jump in and fill Nick's seat. And Nick, we're looking forward to having you back next week here on the Nick and Joe Show. So until next week, ladies and gentlemen, God bless, take care, and we'll catch you on the flip side.
Yeah.